Hello. Let's keep working together on learning how to stay sober and develop a lifestyle of recovery. My name is Troy Faddis, a licensed marriage and family therapist. Last week we got to key 5, and this week we're going to go on. We're going to start as key 5 and move forward. Just a quick overview. The 9 keys are: first, let's develop what our purpose, our reason is for wanting to stay sober. If we don't have that reason, if it's someone else's reason, it's probably not going to be powerful enough to help us overcome the most intense moments we're going to have ahead of us. The second is having an accountability community. Who are the people that we're going to give trust to, that we will allow them to hold us accountable for our sobriety? 3 is time, being able to get as much time sober as possible and doing deliberate practice with that time so that we are rewiring our brains, learning new coping techniques, and building confidence and trust, not just for other people, but our own mind, having confidence and trust that we can do things that are going to be effective and as effective as our old coping techniques, using our strengths, knowing what we're good at and relying on it every day, building confidence in who we are, knowing that we have self-efficacy traits and that we are resilient is an important part of learning to stay sober for a lifetime. And now we're on to key 5, which is to treat the whole person. I mentioned before that the National Institute of Drug Abuse revised their recommendations back in 2018. I think they revised them again in 2019. I was looking at it this morning. And one of the recommendations that they made was treat the whole person. That, substance abuse treatments at times can focus solely on the recovery aspects. It's a triage. And oftentimes for good reason, we're in crisis. Let's get a person to detox. Let's get a person stable. And it needs to go beyond that, because the Irish have a saying that everyone focuses on the drink and not the reason for the drink. And a lot of the reasons why we are using substances or any other addictive behavior pattern is because it's become our way of coping. It's the way that we've learned to deal with the stress, the anxiety, and the lack of stabilization and the lack of attachment in our life. Substance abuse can fill that role really easily. And so if we don't address those things that made it attractable to us in the first place, then we may not be where we're going to revert back to some of our old patterns when those things really come up and expose themselves in our lives. Particularly as we get old, as we get sober, those things tend to come back to the surface. So being able to talk about our medical history, our psychological history, our social and attachment histories. This is why, the research shows that physical exercise and nutrition, as Dr. Ilagardi says, and not he talks about it in terms of the research around depression. And we see some of the same research around treating ADHD. The more prebiotics, which are good green vegetables that we're going to eat, the probiotics, good oral hygiene, the more we're able to manage our executive functioning and our depression, having a minimum of an hour of movement every single day. If we don't start doing our own personal work around our attachment hurts from our family of origin, the relationships that we're in currently, being able to identify, early on oppositionality, personality traits that emerge that were all probably coping techniques. Sometimes from the chronic traumas that we experience every day, maybe as academic trauma at school, and feeling like we weren't good enough or as good as the others, to just having a sense of depression and dread for a lot of reasons that we didn't know how else to deal with. Um, but being able to access that trauma and access that shame, in step 4 and step 5 of the 12-step program, I think that we are often trying to help individuals experience, like, get to that as well through doing a fearless moral inventory and being able to share that with someone, work on it, and learn how to resolve it. Really having a comprehensive treatment plan, one that looks at all the aspects. And as Maddie said in our last webinar, our web class, that that's one of the reasons why we love psychological evaluations. When we're this far into treatment, that people are in an intensive outpatient program, particularly as they're in the residential program, we really want to get a picture of all of it. The projectives that look at the personality profiles, and the symptoms that look at diagnostic profiles, and their substance use profile, and all of those things. Interviews with the family and important people that can give us insight to what might also be going on that is part of what fuels the need for addiction. Number 6, know how your brain works. And these roll into each other as we start to get further into this. They that These keys, they blend in. It's hard to, like, talk about, for example, treat the whole person, and it's hard to talk about time without talking about know how your brain works. But I made this own key because I think that it is really valuable to spend some specific time to understand that it's not just a behavioral disorder, it's not an emotional disorder, it's not a moral deficiency. That when we start to use, it will change the way our brain grows and how it prunes. There's certain times in our lives where our brain neurons are growing the fastest, and also times in our lives when it starts to prune pretty quickly. And when we use substances, it affects that. Dr. John Gottman talks about how we are always, this is for all of us, in what he calls a forward state. I'm engaged, I'm here, I'm leaning in, and I feel safe enough to lean in with you. And then there's also an away state of, like, I'm scared and I'm threatened, and I can't hear this, and I want to, like, pull back and freeze. And sometimes he may say we may pass a neutral state, like we're in between, we're going from one state to the other, but we don't stay in a neutral state. We're either going forward or we're going backwards. And our mind does that as we're using substances. A lot of times our mind goes forward and saying, oh, this works. That did something for me. I want more of that. Like, how do we use that to cope? Because none of our other coping techniques work nearly as well. And as we start talking about, techniques that take more effort and are more difficult and take much more energy, our brain will naturally do it in a away state. And that's one of the reasons why we get defensive, and we get really invested in the lies that we've told ourselves, because it's so important to us to try to find the easy solution in our brains. So knowing that our brain does this, and that our brain is constantly evaluating, again, for efficiency and safety. And so if we can be aware of that and notice how our brain's reacting, in the other brain neurological webinars, we talked about the SCARF model, being able to pick up on how much am I reacting because of those SCARF triggers, and how much am I choosing? Also knowing, like, neurologically, the limbic system, we have a primary emotion. And am I aware of the influence of that? Because the primary emotion is like an early indication system in our minds. And sometimes it's a great indication system, and sometimes it's also accentuating the danger and also accentuating the pleasure, because it wants us to do what it wants. And if we're not paying attention, know that, and factor that in, then sometimes it is our emotions that is driving the bus and not us. And when we're in early recovery, that happens a lot. And so we've got to learn to be controlling, over at least step out, zoom out, and look at it, so that we have a greater chance of being in the driver's seat instead of it being in the driver's seat. And also knowing that this is part of step three, like being able to surrender, to be able to give up, saying, who am I going to trust before I trust myself? Because if this part of my brain is so, one of the things that we know about brains is that intense disorders, addiction and anxiety are two of the most common. They create what we call cognitive dissonance or a cognitive distortion. They literally lie to us. And one of the specific lies that substance use does is that we will over anticipate the reward and we will underestimate the cost. And so that's why it's important, not that we're surrendering our autonomy, or that somehow we're not believing in our own self-efficacy, which is using the key of using our strengths. But it's realizing that if my brain does this and the lies have been pretty powerfully wired, I'm actually regaining control by giving other people power, and I'm going to listen to them. And that's a hardwiring issue. I'm going to give people, even if it's just a temporary thing, say, I'm going to let you have this so that I can perform better in the long run. It's like a coach. If you're performing at a high level, you have a coach that's specifically helping you, whether it's with your if you're in baseball, you have a batting coach. You may have a pitching coach. You may have, any other kind of coach, and you're giving that coach power to, you're going to do things that you wouldn't done on your own, that you probably don't even want to do in the moment, but you're doing it because the coach told you to. And you believe that the coach can zoom out and maybe you can't, and is going to give you good instruction on how to perform. We can do that in other areas of our life because we can see the results. Sports is one example. Sometimes it's with work. Like if I'm writing a paper and I have a copy editor who's telling me, like, I know an article I published a couple of years ago, I worked with a really skilled and talented writer, and and at first I wanted to resist some of these suggestions, but I recognized that his suggestions and the way that he wrote was so far superior to mine. And I learned to really trust that advice. So I think that that's something that we can all learn from by giving others the power to trust that they see things that our brain right now isn't wired to see, and being able to follow that. See, or the other one I want to mention here is knowing how to predict high risk situations through awareness of our trauma and emotional sunburns. From an emotionally focused therapy perspective, you can see Sue Johnson's book right here above my head, Hold Me Tight. She talks about how when we have these attachment injuries, which a lot of people who have an addiction do have attachment injuries, that sometimes, like, our brain is now wired to have what she calls an emotional sunburn, meaning that I'm probably over responsive to a specific like advice from a certain person, or something that I think might threaten my autonomy. And it's not because I don't know that they're right or that I can't follow that advice, but it's because my brain has been wired to be overly sensitive or hyper aroused to those triggers. And so, like, that's when someone touches my emotional sunburn, like, wow, that hurts, and I instantly in that away state. And I think it's, again, knowing how your brain works. One of the valuable parts of knowing how your brain works is recognizing that that's probably what that is. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it doesn't mean that it's right. It's probably accentuating it so that I can stay safe. And I just need to, like, pull back and say, am I overreact? Is this part of my brain overreact? And the more practice we are at that, the more responsive we can be to the cues that others give us. The dopamine hypothesis. One of the things the dopamine hypothesis says is that when we all have a hedonic line, and so we all have natural surges of dopamine, and when it goes across the hedonic line, I feel good, I feel pleasure, I feel excited, like the night before a holiday, and you can't wait to, like, see your family or open gifts. You have that natural woohoo, or before a family vacation, There's a lot of times when you just have that natural injection of dopamine, but also it could be oxytocin. Oxytocin is often considered the cuddle hormone. The more that I'm feeling like I'm holding hands with someone I love, or my mother gives me a hug, that helps release some of the oxytocin, and it feels good. But when we use a substance, we are flooded with some of these chemicals, particularly the dopamine. And so our body is just like when I'm wearing glasses. When you feel glasses, you can feel them on the bridge of your nose. But over time, your brain says, well, that pressure's not going away. So let's stop sending signals to the brain that we have weight on our nose. That's why you have someone walk around the house who has the glasses on their head or here and think, I can't find my glasses. Well, they're on their face because they can't feel it. The same thing happens with pleasure from dopamine, is that we've really reset that hedonic line so high. It's gone from here to here because we've been using so much that when we stop using, we often don't feel pleasure, like the normal things that would have brought us joy, the normal type of experience with other people that would have helped us feel connected and bonded to them. They're just not as strong as what we've readjusted our brains to expect to feel. And that's, again, knowing how your brain works, this will lead into one of our other keys, is why it's so important to recognize like feeling flat, feeling dull, feeling muted is one of the post acute withdrawal symptoms that most people are going to experience. And so, really putting effort into how do I help? One, just normalize that that's what I'm experiencing. That's part of how my brain's working. But also, can I create surges that are more than what are typical so that I can feel good about anything as a reinforcer for what I'm trying to do? And I think it's one of the reasons why being able to give the brain or the director within your brain, the monitor within your brain, um, no matter what. And it's so hard for people who are in recovery because they can't to make when we make decisions, most of us slide into decisions. We don't decide. And as long as we can slide, we always have a back door. We can move our commitment. And and that's fine because for most people that's where they start. Their commitment to recovery is sliding into it. But the more or the closer we can get to, I want to do this no matter what, as long as it takes, and I'm not a victim in it. I have an internal locus of control, not an external locus of control. Then the more powerfully you're going to be able to give your director a script. And this is why AA has so many sayings, like easy does it, one day at a time. Those are simple scripts that we're giving to our brain that allows us to try to program that simplistic director to say, let's not go back to the old pattern. Let's follow the script we've committed to. One of the hardest things about that, like when we say we are feeling some moderate levels of oxytocin, dopamine, we're feeling okay. And that's, I think, where a lot of people get into this experience, especially coming out of primary care. They're like, wow, I feel so good. Like, I think I've got this. I've got this. But they haven't really had a real dose of cortisol. And cortisol is one of those. It's a stress hormone. And it's not like eustress, which can eustress can help create motivation and can be a positive thing. This is not that. Cortisol is a distressing stress. It's like if you can feel the weight on your shoulders and on your mind and in your heart. And it's part of the addiction process. When we experience a lack of coping and an increase of cortisol, that's when our brain says we know what to do, and that is to use. And that part of our brain can be one of the most powerful things that we experience. And learning to turn it off might be, it can feel like it's an impossible task. So if we don't have these things around us, Dr. Kevin McCauley talks about the Swiss cheese analogy. If you had like slices of Swiss cheese, they'll have holes in them. And if you just have like one slice of Swiss cheese, there's lots of holes. You can find your way through. You get two layers of Swiss cheese and stack them next to each other. There's not as many holes to get through. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. When you get all those together, there's no more gaps. And so, again, knowing how your brain works is important because when it finally does betray you, when your brain works against you, you have to have as many things in place as you can to catch it. Otherwise, the chance of relapse is high. And that's why a lot of, well, into one of our other keys, as I said, these blend into each other. One of the keys that is from this one is learn how to have fun again, but the other one is to have a plan. And so when I talk about like being able to have all these layers put together, most of my clients, they just say, well, I've made a mental change. Like I know that I'm going to stay sober. I've made the commitment. So they call it the plan of hope. I want it to work, so it's going to work. And it's not I'm glad that it's there. We need this, that purpose, that's that reason that needs to be there. However, if we don't have, it's like when we're a pilot fighter has a manual that says if this warning light goes on, you do this, this, this. If this warning light goes on, you do this, 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 this. If none of those things work, then eventually you pull the eject button. That's what a written plan is for, and that's part of the protection against the cortisol. So that when things, even if it's just like 0.005% of the time that this will ever occur to us, it's going to, and having a plan for when it happens, we need to be ready. Key 7 is learn how to have fun again. As we talked about earlier, knowing how your brain works, the dopamine hypothesis talks about how the hedonic line has adjusted to a higher level, so we don't feel like we don't feel enjoyment like we used to. We feel numb often, and it's like in early recovery, we feel there's no reinforcement. It's like, is this worth it? And so that's why, like, putting legit time and a plan together to learn to have adventure, what Dr. McCauley calls to have thrill. When Kevin comes down and he will often do a day workshop for us and all of our staff and all of our clients, and he is so generous with his time. And one of the trade-offs that he does for compensation is he loves it when we take him repelling. So I watched Kevin doing this himself. Is that he loves getting on a 180-foot rappel and dropping into a canyon and walking through these tight slots, learning to feel joy, adventure, and thrill. So many people in recovery, they are into like rock climbing and into mountain biking and into skiing, and they do it at such a high extreme level, it becomes part of their part-time job is pursuing some of these adventures, because it's starting to, as part of it is rewiring their brain. Dr. Keith Russell talks about in some of his research around wellness therapy in particular, of what he calls the soft fascination, which is the demonstration that we can record and notice that being outdoors, again, hiking, climbing summits, overcoming challenges together. Dr. Widmer from, he also talks about some of this outdoor research where he is saying to us that when we can have a group of people who plan and anticipate challenges and can overcome challenges together and can process what they learn from those challenges, the impact that has a staying power. It sticks. Like those type of things stick with us because they rewire the brain. Those difficult, hard, but satisfying experiences can rewire the brain more powerfully, more quickly than doing something slowly over time. Having novel experiences, like the first time you do something, you probably remember it than the 100th time you did it. All of these things are such a powerful experience. You can see here at my new home office, the antlers I have around. Bow hunting has been a passion, and there's just this thing that I've noticed, that when you're actually out bow hunting, like it's such a novel adventure experience as you are tracking animal, as you're um, sitting in a stand and waiting and anticipating, and just like the mindfulness that goes into that type of activity is powerful, and that rewires the brain. It rewires the brain profoundly. Yeah, I'm sure you can all think of like things that you'll never forget, and maybe it's because of a person, it's because of an accomplishment. Like the time that your team won, this championship that you guys had all worked your whole high school careers to get to, or the time that you got married, or the time that you got a job, or accomplished, so you defended your dissertation. um, those things wire in our brain like nothing else can. And they don't all have to be so epic. I mean, it can be things like paintballing. And one of my there's a lot of programs around here that do a sober living, and there's a lot of community support in creating like little community support sports teams, and what do you call it, extracurricular sports teams. That's not the word, but intramurals. And just like doing all the, like one of the ones that we do at Legacy when we're not in quarantine from COVID, is like we do a competitive night of volleyball, and it's one of the things I look forward to the most, is just really learning how to be competitive and have fun in that setting. So learning how to have fun again. And then we talked a little bit again about having a plan. Like it's like the Swiss cheese model. Like all these things, we can put them all in place, but there's going to be moments, even if they're not as common. We have to have a plan for when these things hit us. They're all going to. And it's like that, as I said earlier, that the pilot, when the warning signs start going off in the cockpit, they've been trained, they've practiced, they've done protocols, and they have it written. They've done all of those things, and they go through a system. And when it's all over, they if they can't fix it from their manual, they eject. And that's exactly what I'm looking for with our clients. I'd like to use what's called the Gorski relapse prevention model. As a professor from Rutgers University in New Jersey that developed a plan, partly on cognitive behavioral therapy that and it's also based on what was working. Be able to, if we look at like addiction recovery management, which I think is one of the uh, the resources I mentioned here. Um, it talks about like when we look at all the meta-analysis for the last 25 years of what works, being able to have these type of like written plans is a powerful protective factor. And so Dr. Gorski talked about high risk mapping, where we take all the stuff and we put it into like what are our five, we know ourselves, we've relapsed in the past, and say, all right, like what are our five most dangerous situations that we have faced or that we'll most likely face in the future. There's probably those small percentage of time when I'm going to like lose it, and this is all going to fail me and I'm going to need something. Like anticipate what those are. Like, I have some experience doing this. We all have a PhD in recovery, or at least our own use, and use that information and say, all right, let's come with my top 5 list. If we have to, it's our top 10. Do a David Letterman top 10 list and literally map them out and say, all right, and I'll just say it begins with the behavior, but saying like emotionally what's going on before this event happens. Like what are the emotional things that are going to make me vulnerable? What are the situational things that are going to make me vulnerable? What are the mental health, the family, the perfect storm that's going to make me vulnerable? Like here we are sitting here in COVID. I don't know if anyone's could have imagined that, but if I'm quarantined and I'm away from my resources, like what type of situations make me vulnerable in that setting? If I'm going to a sober living after another level of care, like what's unique about that setting that might make me vulnerable? If I'm going to a family event, whether it's a wedding or a holiday, what's going to make me vulnerable? And like, let's make a plan, a bullet point, boom, 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 boom. And then part of this plan is I have clients circle every place that they could have made an exit. And every place they made an exit, draw a line out, maybe to another page, or if it's a big page, maybe it's blank space. And what's my action plan? What's my 5 steps I'm going to take so that I can utilize that exit? And then I usually have people get a red marker, a red pencil, and they draw what I call a red line, you know, because we all relapse before we actually relapse. We're going to relapse in our mind, we're like, we know, we call it the point of no return. Like, I want people to acknowledge that once I get past this point, like, I haven't used yet, but I'm going to, and it's probably not going to be stopping me. So I want people to like be able to acknowledge that, and know, like, I've got to choose my exits before then, not after then. And every time I'm successful, I'm probably, maybe that red line moves and moves and moves. And so something we have to continually to improve on and work on is our action plans. So after plan, you can refer back to some of these other webinars we did, like on the aftercare planning webinar, is that one of our biggest mistakes I see with having a plan is that people are choosing what they want and not necessarily what they need. Right? Like, that's part of the cognitive dissonance, the cognitive distortions that happen for all of us. That our wants is part of what creates cognitive distortion. And so we often will choose a level of care that has enough exposure, because that's what we want, but maybe too much exposure than we were actually ready for. And so I ask everyone to be just honest with themselves. Am I being honest that I am really ready for this level of care? Number nine. And I didn't put number nine last because it's not important. It is. In fact, some of the research shows that it's the most important. And also, as a marriage and family therapist, I figured if I put it first, that everyone would think I was biased. But the outcome research, especially for young men, but for young women too, but the outcome research, I think, particularly points us towards young men, is that family therapy is one of the most successful ways of treating addiction and helping people get into recovery. And not just to treat it, but for it to stick. Like, not initially, like a lot of times, like cognitive behavioral therapy will produce change. It does very well, but it slides. Um, when we do good family therapy, like emotionally focused family therapy, systemic family therapy, those type of things have really demonstrated longer lasting outcomes for young adults in recovery. And some of these big meta-analysis, they don't necessarily parse out like what specifically about family therapy is so successful, but I have some of my impressions from my own experiences and my clients' experiences. And it's not just about like making things better so that they can become a support group, and that may be, but I think it really is about helping us understand, one, maladaptive behaviors within our family systems, because a lot of the reasons why, or the context in which our use began, or our depression or our anxiety increased, was probably within those maladaptive patterns that we had as a family. A lot of the stuff that we do that's a little bit off today either comes from our family of origin or from the relationship we are currently in. And so one part of family therapy is dealing with and working on some of those maladaptive patterns that are around us and in us. But I think that again, that's why I put down like Bowen work or family of origin work, and some of those are some of my favorite, I think most productive approaches. But the second part of that, more from an emotionally focused family therapy perspective, is about addressing attachment injuries, because our attachment style, it begins even sometimes before birth, but our attachment style is going to be based on the attachments of our parents and our grandparents and the experiences that we have had with them. And so if we have a secure attachment style, it is a major protective factor, not only in preventing but in also recovering from addiction. And most of us who are in addiction, research shows, have an insecure attachment style. And sometimes it's an avoidant style. It's a anxious, preoccupied style. Um, the all the insecure styles have a higher risk factor, a high comorbidity with substance use. And when we settle some of those reactivities down, when we can address our physiological response, then our emotional response, change the moves that we're doing with our family members, and for them to change the moves that they're doing with us. and for us to put some of our blocks down and to start to feel the security and the safety that we can from having secure person that we trust, that we know is there. And it doesn't have to be like with us all the time because we carry these people in our minds. They're with us almost all the time. And the more secure, like when I know I have someone who has my back, I have someone who doesn't judge me but loves me no matter what, and that is going to help me walk through this without, they may have a strong reaction to me being hurt, but they're not going to reject me in it. When we have that in our lives, it gives us the confidence to do hard things and to explore and to learn. When we don't have those things, we get afraid and we run away and we hide and we get really reactive and super defensive. So I think that those are some of the reasons why we see in the outcome data that family therapy is one of the most productive forms of treatment. And in fact, in some analysis studies where it shows, like cognitive behavioral approaches compared with motivational interviewing approaches, compared to 12-step approaches, compared to family therapy approaches. The family therapy approach group had the greatest improvement and the longer lasting results. I believe that if the studies looked at another group that had all of those, all of the above, they probably would have had the very best results. And that's why I think that it can't be just one-sided. It has to be holistic and it has to include all of these things. So those are the 9 keys as they stand today. I add to them as I learn more and gain more. I hope this was helpful. And my experience is that if we spend the time, like this number one priority for the first year is studying, working, and committing to these things on a daily basis and hourly basis, that we can be successful and we will be. Thank you all for joining me. Stay healthy and stay happy. Stay safe.